Do not speak their names. Do not ask where they went. And above all, do not dig near the creek. That was the whispered warning passed between children in Sumner County, Tennessee, a place where silence became tradition and tradition became survival. But the question was never really if someone would dig. The question was when and what they would find when they did. In 1987, a drought hit the valley so hard the earth cracked open like old skin. Bledsoe Creek, once swollen and impassable, shriveled to a muddy vein. It exposed things the land had swallowed whole, fragments of rusted iron, shattered glass, and then what the state archaeologists later called human remains inconsistent with formal burial standards. That's a sanitized way of saying something else entirely. Mass graves, unmarked, unmapped, and far too many for comfort. The official report mentioned 26 bodies. Unofficially, locals say the real number was 74. No headstones, no names, no records, just bones. And at the center of this forgotten graveyard stood the red brick husk of what once was Tennessee's pride, the Chamberlain Cotton Mill, a monument to war profiteering, forced labor, and one man's obsession with empire. This is not a story about cotton. This is a story about what men do when power becomes a god, and blood is the currency they offer in worship. You've never heard of Jeremiah Chamberlain. That's no accident. His name was erased, not by history, but by design. A calculated deletion, because Jeremiah wasn't just another northern industrialist come south during the Civil War. He wasn't just a businessman with union contracts and gold in his pockets. He was something older, something colder, a practitioner of silence, a man who understood that if you build your house on bones, you don't put windows in the basement. But the cracks always come, and they always start small. A boy with a spyglass, a shoe beneath a floorboard, a ledger that never made it to the fire. You were taught that America's wealth was built on grit, on sweat, on freedom. What if I told you that some of it, just enough to keep the lights on, was built on obliteration, on souls that were not freed, but fed into the machinery? This isn't ancient history. This isn't folklore. The Chamberlain Mill operated at full capacity from 1863 to 1867. In those 4 years, it generated the equivalent of $12 million in today's currency, more than any other textile operation in the Union-occupied South. And then, it closed, abruptly, quietly, without scandal, without audit, without explanation. No bankruptcy filings, no lawsuits, just gone. And yet the Chamberlain family only grew richer. Their political influence expanded. They funded campaigns, endowed universities, changed names, changed cities, but never changed their methods. They built an American dynasty on a southern graveyard, and every man who tried to expose them, discredited, disappeared, forgotten. The land remembers, the bones remember, and now you will remember. But I warn you, what you're about to hear cannot be unheard. Once you begin this descent, there is no return to ignorance, only deeper understanding, and the weight that comes with it. If you're still here, if you haven't looked away, then you're the kind of man this story was meant for. So steel your nerves and listen closely, because the story of Jeremiah Chamberlain is not over. It's just been buried. Shall we dig? Tennessee wasn't just torn, it was shattered. Union flags flew over courthouses, but loyalty was a shadow game. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Boys disappeared into regiments and came back as men with dead eyes. Farms rotted, roads turned to rivers of mud and blood. Law was something you paid for, and fear, it settled like ash on every rooftop. It was in this chaos that Jeremiah Chamberlain thrived. He didn't wear a uniform, but make no mistake, he was a general. His battlefield was the ledger, the contract, the hidden clause. While soldiers bled in trenches, Jeremiah signed papers in quiet rooms. And while most men saw cotton as a crop, he saw it for what it truly was, a weapon. Cotton clothed armies, filled coffers, bought alliances, and in the hands of the right man, it could buy silence. He built his empire on efficiency, he claimed, but anyone who looked too close saw something else, something colder. His workforce never complained, never unionized, never even spoke much outside the mill. They came in on wagons, but no one remembered them ever leaving. The first man who asked about this was Pastor Elijah Moore, a Presbyterian preacher with more courage than caution. He started asking around about the workers, where they lived, where they worshipped, where their children played. 3 Sundays after his sermon on the sanctity of life, the pastor's church burned to the ground, no cause ever determined. Moore moved north within the week. His last sermon notes, retrieved from the ashes, contained just 3 words: "Something is wrong." It always started like that. Someone noticed something. Then the storm came. You see, Jeremiah Chamberlain didn't kill people. Not directly. That's too messy, too obvious. What he did was simpler and far more effective. He erased them. Names scratched from rosters, addresses vanished from town ledgers, births unrecorded. Death was undocumented. Entire families wiped clean like chalk from a slate. And yet, the town benefited. Federal dollars flowed into Gallatin, new shops opened, schools expanded, roads were paved. Everyone looked the other way. Because Jeremiah Chamberlain wasn't a villain in their eyes, he was deliverance, the man who made war profitable. But there was a boy. Always, it begins with a boy. Caleb Craven, 12 years old, curious, unafraid. His family's land bordered the mill. He liked to fish at Bledsoe Creek, watch the wagons come and go. He noticed the strange patterns before any adult did, how some workers arrived with families and trunks but never unpacked, how the smoke from the mill was darker on certain nights, how sometimes the air smelled like iron, not from machinery, but like rusted nails and wet stone. He told his father, and that's when the danger truly began. Thomas Craven was no fool. He'd seen men disappear before. He'd fought in the Mexican War. He knew what power smelled like. When Chamberlain came knocking with a smile and $500 in gold, Thomas understood exactly what it meant. Keep your boy quiet. Sell the land. Walk away. He did. But silence is never a full solution, especially when a child has seen too much, especially when he finds a shoe buried beneath a floorboard, a child's shoe, with initials and a date. The story doesn't end there. It never does. Because something in Caleb didn't sleep after that. Something woke up, a sense of wrongness that couldn't be soothed with gold coins or father's warnings. He started watching, mapping, writing things down. The mill wasn't just a factory. It was a machine of disappearance. A processing center for cotton. And something else. Something far more human. They said the Chamberlain mill never stopped working, even during snowstorms or supply shortages. That's because cotton was only half the equipment. Iron, the other half. That's what no one was allowed to see, until now. You're here because part of you already knows. You've felt it, beneath the surface of official stories, that buried knowledge. The wagons always left just before sunrise, 3 of them, covered in canvas tarps, pulled by mules trained not to bray. No lanterns, no voices, just the low creak of wheels over frost-hardened earth. Caleb Craven, armed with nothing more than his spyglass and a worn journal, tracked them from his attic window. Every 3rd night, like clockwork, they departed from the backside of the mill, not the loading dock used for cotton shipments, but the narrow trail behind the storage shed. The same shed where Caleb had once seen a line of figures marched in during the blizzard, never to return. The path those wagons followed was not part of any known county road. It wound through a stretch of woods that bordered Bledsoe Creek, avoiding bridges, avoiding witnesses, avoiding disruption. Caleb marked the route in pencil and ink, little arrows drawn beside trees he could recognize by shape alone. The wagons never went toward town. They went south, always south. What lay in that direction? Swampland, abandoned plantations, the ruins of 2 burned churches, and one very old place the locals refused to enter after dusk, Deacon's Hollow, a natural depression in the earth dense with sycamores and hush. Caleb had never been there himself. His father had forbidden it. Too many old stories, too many hunters who never came back. But that's exactly where the wagons vanished. The trail ended near a dry creek bed lined with stone. Caleb followed on foot once, weeks later, when the ground was still soft with winter thaw. He waited until after the wagons returned empty. What he found chilled him. 3 parallel sets of drag marks leading to the lip of a collapsed ravine. Not wheel tracks, drag marks. Like something heavy had been pulled from the wagons and dumped over the edge. At the bottom, half buried in wet leaves and clay, were bones. Not animal bones. Too long, too thin. Some still wrapped in strips of cloth. The realization struck him like lightning. These were the missing workers, the refugees who had vanished from the mill's employment ledgers, the ones no one asked about, the ones no one buried. Caleb stumbled back through the woods, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He knew now that the mill didn't just process cotton, it consumed people. And it did so with such precision, such cold efficiency, that even death left no record, no funerals, no witnesses, just bones in the hollow. And yet, even this discovery wasn't the deepest layer of the truth. Because a week later, as Caleb lay hidden behind a hay cart near the mill's rear loading dock, he heard something that would change everything. 2 of Chamberlain's men, foremen, voices he recognized from town, arguing in hushed tones. One of them, a tall man with a distinct southern drawl, said the words Caleb would never forget. "We need to finish the 74 before the equinox. That's what he paid for. That's the contract." The other hissed back, "We're already at 73, just one more, then it's done." 74. Not a number you associate with accounting, not a number you assign to labor quotas. It sounded like a ritual, like an offering. Who was the contract with? The government, some secret buyer, or something else entirely? That night, Caleb didn't sleep, not from fear, but from something darker, certainty. The Chamberlain operation wasn't just corrupt, it wasn't just cruel, it was designed, constructed around a purpose that reached beyond money, a purpose that required 74 lives. The final one, he suspected, had not yet been claimed, and if those men were counting correctly, he might be next. Spring came late that year. The trees around Gallatin bloomed reluctantly, as if even nature recoiled from what had been fed into the soil. But with each rising sun, the mill grew louder. More wagons, more workers, more cotton flowing into those red brick walls, and never coming back out the same. Jeremiah Chamberlain remained a ghost in plain sight. His public appearances were rare, but perfectly timed. A donation to the county hospital, a speech at the courthouse, a Sunday visit to the First Baptist pews, always wearing that same black wool suit and gold chain, always shaking hands with men who knew better than to ask questions. Behind that civility, though, something had shifted. Chamberlain no longer walked the mill floor. He no longer ate in public. His carriage was seen arriving at midnight and leaving before dawn. The townsfolk chalked it up to stress, to war, to the burdens of command. But Caleb Craven had seen the truth in Chamberlain's eyes during that brief meeting at his home, the glint of calculation, of pressure, of someone obeying rules even darker than the ones he enforced. It was Margaret Craven, Caleb's mother, who broke the silence first. She had noticed it too. The smell that lingered on the wind some nights, sharp, sweet, rotten, the way their chickens wouldn't wander near the creek anymore. The strange symbols carved into the bark of a sycamore tree just past the mill's boundary fence. At first, Thomas dismissed it. War does strange things, he said, makes men forget how to be normal. But Margaret had been raised on old stories, the kind passed from grandmothers who could read signs in clouds and bones. One night, while washing dishes, she said aloud what Caleb had only dared to write in his journal. That man didn't build a mill, he built a gate. A gate to what, neither of them could answer. But the word stuck, it echoed. Because as spring ripened and the 15th of May approached, the date of the spring equinox by the old Julian calendar, Caleb noticed something terrifying. The wagons had stopped. No more shipments, no more workers. The trail to Deacon's Hollow had gone quiet. It wasn't peace, it was preparation. Something was about to happen. Then, late one night, as thunder rolled across the Tennessee sky like warning drums, a single wagon left the mill. Only one. And this time, it didn't take the back road. It came straight down the main road, passing the caravan house, slow and deliberate. Caleb stood in the shadows of the porch and watched as the driver, hooded, hunched, stared straight ahead, not steering, just guiding the mules. On the wagon, under the tarp, something moved. The next morning, the caravans woke to find a package on their doorstep, wrapped in butcher paper, tied with twine, no note, no address. Inside was a book, The Lesser Key of Solomon, an ancient grimoire of demonology dating back to the 17th century, pages marked in red, symbols that matched the carvings on the trees, and tucked inside a sheet of parchment in Jeremiah Chamberlain's handwriting. It read, "There are thresholds, there are prices, and there are numbers that must be completed." That was the moment Thomas Caravan understood. They were never meant to be witnesses. They were meant to be part of it. Caleb had been marked, not because he spoke, but because he saw. And in seeing, he had become the final piece, the 74th, the completion. Whatever this ritual was, economic, supernatural, or something more ancient, it was coming to a head. And now the Caravan family wasn't just surviving next to a machine of death. They were standing on its altar. The doors to the Chamberlain cotton mill were made of iron and oak, 12 feet tall, bolted from the inside with custom-forged locks that bore no keyhole. Workers came and went through the side annex, but the central structure, the heart of the mill, remained sealed. Locals called it the sanctum. No one questioned why cotton didn't need light or airflow. No one questioned why foremen wore gloves in summer, or why the windows were bricked shut from the inside. But Caleb Caravan had spent too many nights sketching the building from afar, watching how deliveries entered one side and silence emerged from the other. Whatever happened inside wasn't industrial. It was sacred, or profane, possibly both. On the night of May 13th, with clouds choking the moon and dogs howling across the valley, Caleb made his move. The distraction came in the form of a fire at the lumberyard, likely staged because the Chamberlain men arrived too quickly, already armed, already shouting orders. It was just enough chaos. Caleb slipped in through the rear storage loft, prying open a rotted window that overlooked the boiler house. What he saw inside stopped his breath. The walls weren't brick. They were covered in blackened wood panels etched with sigils, the kind he'd seen in The Lesser Key. The same sigils were carved into the floor, forming concentric circles like a ritual map that radiated from the center of the room. And in that center, an altar, not a religious one. It looked like a surgical table made of wrought iron and copper, stained, grooved. There were manacles at the ends, darkened by rust, or something worse. Above it, suspended from the rafters, hung a chandelier not of candles, but of bones. Real ones, polished and arranged to mimic the twisting structure of cotton roots, human jawbones, vertebrae, finger bones. There were no looms, no spindles, no machines of any kind. Only boson, elix. On the far wall stood 7 cabinets, each labeled in Latin. Caleb couldn't decipher them all, but one caught his eye. Sanguinem pactum, blood pact. Inside were vials, row after row, labeled with initials and numbers, 374, 1974, 4274, the last one, empty, number 74. Caleb knew then that this wasn't about production, it wasn't about profit. The cotton mill was a disguise, a ritual chamber masked as commerce. Every worker who had vanished wasn't simply killed, they were offered. Their blood collected and stored, their bodies disposed of, not to conceal crime, but to fulfill a covenant. But with whom? That question was answered when Caleb heard the chanting, low, guttural, coming from the sub-level beneath the altar. He crept to the trapdoor at the corner of the room, pulled it open, and peered down into the candle-lit abyss. There were 9 figures robed in black, standing around a pit carved into the earth. In the center, bound and blindfolded, was a man, still alive, trembling, his mouth gagged with linen. Caleb recognized him. His name was Eli Carpenter, a preacher who had gone missing 3 weeks earlier after preaching a sermon against Chamberlain's expansion. His sermon had ended with the words, "What does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul?" and now his soul was about to be sold. Caleb didn't stay. He fled, silent and sick, his mind reeling from the horror of it. He now understood that the mill's wealth wasn't accidental. It was the product of obedience to ancient laws, laws that required death, precision, sacrifice. 74 wasn't random, it was a fixed price, paid in full, a transaction that Chamberlain had been upholding for years. And now, with only one life remaining to complete the ritual, Caleb wasn't just a witness anymore, he was the debt unpaid. The Chamberlain legacy was never written in ink. It was carved into land deeds, into grave markers without names, into the psyches of men who had outlived their usefulness. By the summer of 1864, whispers of Chamberlain's wealth had reached Memphis, then Atlanta, and even Richmond. The Cotton King of Tennessee, they called him. What they didn't know, what no one outside Gallatin could ever imagine, was that this dynasty wasn't built on cotton. It was built on silence, ritual, and a pact older than the Republic itself. After the night inside the mill, Caleb Craven became a hunted man. Not openly, no sheriff knocked at his door, no letters came bearing threats. The danger was subtler. His friends stopped speaking to him. Strangers watched him from porches they didn't belong to. His father began forgetting entire days, waking up with soil under his fingernails and no memory of leaving the house. Margaret found their well tainted with a black mold that no doctor could identify. The Chamberlains were sending a message: you saw what was never meant to be seen. But Caleb didn't run. Instead, he dug deeper. Through old family records and courthouse archives, he traced the Chamberlain bloodline back to 1782, just after the Revolutionary War. Jeremiah's grandfather, Enoch Chamberlain, had arrived from Massachusetts with 3 wagons, 12 indentured workers, and 1 sealed iron chest that no customs official was allowed to open. Within a year, Enoch owned 300 acres and had erected the first mill in Sumner County. That original mill burned to the ground in 1799 during a freak lightning storm, but not before 17 workers went missing over the span of a single summer. No bodies, no arrests, just disappearances. The fire didn't stop them, it sealed the myth. From the ashes rose a stronger structure, more isolated, more fortified. Enoch died in 1811, but not before writing a final letter to his son, Jeremiah's father, urging him to maintain the count and protect the gate. That phrase appeared again and again in Chamberlain family letters and estate papers: the gate must not close. It wasn't metaphor, it was instruction. The Chamberlains weren't cotton merchants, they were caretakers of an ancient inheritance, a spiritual trust that required payment in blood to keep a passage open. To what? That part remained elusive. The texts Caleb found in the Lesser Key hinted at something called Aratron, a force, a deity, perhaps a demon of dominion and wealth, tied to the planetary sphere of Saturn. Offerings to Aratron, the texts warned, bring great power in exchange for strict obedience, but failure to complete a cycle brings ruin. The cycle, as Caleb now understood, was 74 names, 74 offerings, and in 1864, the Chamberlain line had reached number 73. The final act was imminent. Caleb was not just the intended victim, he was the last ingredient, a descendant of one of the original indentured families brought by Enoch in 1782. The bloodlines had to balance, the old magic demanded symmetry. But if the blood could bind, could it also break? That was the question Caleb now faced. Alone, hunted, marked, he no longer had the luxury of fear. He had only one choice: reveal everything, tell the world, burn the lie. Because if Jeremiah Chamberlain succeeded in completing the ritual, the wealth would not only grow, it would metastasize. The Chamberlain name would become immortal, untouchable. Their empire would stretch beyond cotton, beyond Tennessee, into politics, finance, and religion, a dynasty not of men, but of principality. And it would all begin with Caleb's disappearance. The first fire didn't take. Caleb lit it beneath the west annex of the mill, behind the old carriage bay, at a place he knew the night guards rarely patrolled. He used turpentine, lard, and dried tobacco leaves, everything that would catch quick and burn long. But by morning, not a single flame remained, not even smoke. The boards were untouched, cool to the touch, as if the fire had never existed. That's when Caleb realized the Chamberlains had done more than seal their mill in secrecy. They had fortified it, spiritually, wards, symbols, obedience to laws far older than Tennessee. So he changed tactics. The goal was no longer to destroy the building, but to expose it. If he could uncover the ritual publicly, if he could force a confrontation under daylight, then the magic, which thrived in shadow, would wither, or so he hoped. He began writing letters, dozens of them, to church leaders, county magistrates, abolitionist circles, even journalists in Nashville. He detailed everything: the altar, the sigils, the human remains, the blood vials. He signed each one anonymously. Witness 74. Only one man responded. A Jesuit priest named Father Adlai Croft, based in Louisville, sent back a 3-page letter filled with Latin quotations and grim warnings. "What you've discovered is not unique," the priest wrote. "Every empire has its gate. Rome had theirs, so did Babylon, so does London, but here in America the Gnostic flame hides under Protestant roofs. You've stumbled into a liturgy of control, sorcery disguised as capitalism." Croft agreed to meet. Caleb made the trip north in secret, wearing borrowed clothes, changing wagons twice to avoid the Chamberlain riders. He arrived at the rectory on July the 2nd. What Croft revealed shook him even deeper than the mill itself. There were other families, other dynasties. The Chamberlains were not operating alone. They were one node, in a web that stretched across the new nation. The Carrows of Virginia, the Albrechts of Pennsylvania, the Dunwits of Massachusetts. Each family presided over a different function: cotton, iron, paper, wheat, and each conducted their own rituals, their own blood counts. 74, 77, 99. The numbers varied, but the pattern remained. Croft called them the enumerated houses. Their power did not come from profit margins, it came from sacrifice. The appearance of wealth was merely a cover, a necessary shell to preserve the inner core of power. And when one house neared the end of its cycle, they began to hunt. Not randomly, but genealogically. The blood had to match. The spell demanded ancestral parity. And Caleb, by lineage, was the last stone in the Chamberlain foundation. Croft gave him 2 things before they parted: a reliquary, small, silver, containing what he claimed was a fragment of bone from a Roman martyr, and a warning: once the 74th soul is taken, the gate will remain open for 74 years. No law will bind them, no fire will touch them. The next generation will be born kings. But if the cycle was broken, if the final soul refused to be taken, the entire structure could collapse. The magic would turn inward. The wealth would rot. The land would turn to salt. That was why the Chamberlains were so desperate to kill him. Caleb now carried 2 truths: the fate of a dynasty and the key to its undoing. He returned to Tennessee with a plan, no longer a fugitive but a saboteur, a curse in reverse, a man who would not die quietly, because if they wanted the 74th soul, they would have to take it by force, and if they failed, their gate would close. Forever. The night Caleb returned to Gallatin, a storm rolled in without warning. No thunder, no lightning, just sheets of cold rain that soaked the dirt roads and masked the sound of his boots as he crossed through Chamberlain territory like a ghost. He didn't head home. Home was no longer safe. His father had vanished days ago, last seen wandering toward the riverbank, eyes hollow, lips moving silently. Margaret's cabin stood abandoned, the door swinging open, chickens pecking at empty feed troughs. The Chamberlains had cleared the board. Caleb was alone now, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had the reliquary in his coat, he had Father Croft's instructions, and he had something the Chamberlains had never accounted for: knowledge. He knew the location of the original altar, the true altar. Not the public one in the east hall of the mill, but the subterranean chamber beneath it, accessible only through a bricked-over well behind the tool barn. The entrance had been forgotten by most, but Caleb had found the reference in Enoch Chamberlain's estate ledger. Drainage passage sealed 1832, no longer required for invocation. But Croft had explained, old rites were like vines. They grew wild, but they always returned to the root. If Caleb could reach the altar, disrupt the geometry, smear the sigils, place the martyr's relic at the center of the rite, he could collapse the lattice, not just for the Chamberlains, but for the other houses as well. The gate would fracture. He waited until midnight. The rain kept the guards distracted. One stood at the front of the mill, half asleep, rifle leaning against his shoulder. Another patrolled the south wall, muttering curses at the weather. No one watched the barn. Caleb slipped behind it, pried loose the rotted boards with a rusted fence hook, and uncovered the well. The bricks gave way easier than he expected. Time had weakened them, or something deeper wanted them broken. He climbed down into darkness. What he found beneath the earth was not a room, it was a temple. Massive stones arranged in precise angles, pulsed faintly with heat despite the wet air. Symbols, older than Hebrew, older than Sumerian, coiled across the walls like ivy. In the center sat a slab of black obsidian, untouched by dust. And behind it, resting upright like a tombstone, was the final marker, a marble tablet etched with one name, Caleb Craven, and the date, July 17th, 1864, just 5 days from now. The ritual had already begun. His blood had already been claimed. He stepped forward, heart pounding, and removed the reliquary. Croft had warned him to place it at the exact center of the altar, aligned with the northernmost point of the chamber. He did so, and the change was immediate. A vibration surged through the stone. The sigils dimmed. The air grew still. For a moment, Caleb felt weightless, like something had peeled back the walls of the world. Then came the sound. A shriek, not of pain, but of rage. From the altar itself. The Chamberlains felt it. Miles away, Jeremiah Chamberlain dropped a crystal tumbler of bourbon, hand shaking, as blood began to leak from his nose. In Nashville, a bank clerk working for the Chamberlain Trust stared in horror as every ledger page turned black. And beneath the mill, the stones began to crack. Caleb had done it. He had infected the spell, and now, for the first time in 100 years, the Chamberlain dynasty was vulnerable. But it wouldn't end peacefully. Because a wounded empire doesn't die quietly, it devours. And the hunt for Caleb was about to begin. The Chamberlains did not mourn, they mobilized. By sunrise, every runner, rider, and hired blade in Sumner County had been summoned. The mills ceased operations, the workers were sent home, the guards were doubled. Not a single wagon entered or exited Gallatin without inspection. Jeremiah Chamberlain, blood crusting in his nostrils, stood at the top of the courthouse steps and read a proclamation that no one dared to question. The fugitive Craven has committed an act of spiritual treason. Harboring him shall be punished as murder. Delivering him ensures your family's security forever. Then he lit the paper aflame in front of the crowd and walked away. He didn't have to explain the rest. The people knew. In this town, Chamberlain law came before state law, before God's law, and Craven had spit in the face of all three. What they didn't know, what Jeremiah hadn't yet told even his own blood, was what the ritual's fracture meant. The altar wasn't just damaged, it was reversing. The 74 souls that had been sealed beneath the ground were no longer silent. Each night, new signs appeared. Strange cries near the fields, clocks stopping at 3:33 a.m., horses found standing in circles, eyes wide, trembling, and worst of all, the cotton began to die. Not rot, not spoil, just stop growing, as if the soil had made a decision. Desperation bled into fury. Jeremiah summoned the Council of Three, the innermost circle of the dynasty, his brother Silas, who had studied in Prague under occult financiers, his cousin Ruthie, who had not aged a day since 1839, and his daughter Mercy, the quiet one, whose visions had always proven true. They met in the old parlor house behind locked doors, at a table carved from cedar that had been watered with blood long before any of them were born. Mercy arrived last, eyes closed, barefoot, lips moving. When she opened them, she spoke on, a sentence that froze the room. Caleb has not broken the gate. He's turned it inside out. Silas was the first to panic. Then the 74, they will seek justice? No, said Mercy. They will seek balance, and balance requires a toll. Jeremiah leaned forward, voice tight. Then we find him, and we finish the rite. But Ruthie shook her head. He's not hiding in flesh. He's hiding in memory, in name. The boy has woven himself into the very history of this town, and that cannot be undone with bullets. Jeremiah rose. Then we change the history. That night, the Chamberlains began rewriting the public record. Newspaper archives were burned. Family Bibles were seized. Marriage registries were edited. The name Craven was scrubbed from every page in every ledger, church roll, and land deed. Even gravestones were sanded down to bare rock. The past was being erased, one line at a time. But Caleb had anticipated this. He had already begun carving his story elsewhere, in letters, in whispered testimonies, in coded etchings on barn walls and fence posts, and in a journal he had left beneath the floorboards of a former schoolhouse, an account of every ritual, every death, every secret, signed the 74th. While the Chamberlains burned documents, truth was blooming underground. The dynasty was at war now, not with a man, but with a myth. And myths don't bleed. They spread. She came on horseback from the west through the black pines and fog, wearing a wide-brimmed hat low over her eyes, a coat of oilskin stitched with symbols no local could read, and a satchel that rattled with bones. Her name was never given, only whispered, the archivist. She rode alone, but every raven in the county seemed to follow her, watching from fence posts and church steeples as she passed. Sheriff Bell tried to stop her at the county line, his pistol jammed. His horse collapsed mid-step. By the time he crawled to the roadside, bleeding from both ears, she was already gone. Witnesses say she didn't even slow down. The Chamberlains knew who she was, or rather, what she was. Jeremiah called an emergency convocation that same night. Mercy Chamberlain refused to speak. She simply stood by the hearth, head bowed, whispering to something no one else could see. Ruthie hissed at her, demanded answers. Silas demanded blood. But Jeremiah Chamberlain sat quietly, fingers steepled, jaw tight. He knew the legends. He knew what it meant when the archivist came east. It meant the past had grown teeth. And someone, Caleb Craven, had fed it, because the archivist didn't appear unless called. Somewhere in the ruins of the original altar, in the still slick residue of disrupted ritual, Caleb had planted more than the martyr's relic. He had planted a name, one lost to time, one forbidden in every Chamberlain record, a name the dynasty had buried generations ago because they feared what it might return. But Caleb had unearthed it, spoken it, offered it like kindling to the flame. And now the archivist had returned to collect what was hers. She found Caleb before nightfall. He was hiding in the cellar beneath the old mill schoolhouse, half-starved, half-mad, clutching a matchbook and a flask of oil, prepared to die before capture. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She simply opened the door and stepped inside, her presence dimming every lantern in a 5-mile radius. Caleb dropped the match. "You're not one of them," he rasped. She nodded once. "But I was." Then she tossed something at his feet, a blade wrapped in wax cloth, etched with rusted runes. Its hilt was bound in faded red thread. Its edge was chipped, not from age, but from use. Caleb hesitated. "What is it?" "A severance," she replied. "It cuts bloodlines." He stared at the weapon, afraid to touch it. "You'll need it," she continued, "if you want to end the Chamberlains. Their kind can't be killed by bullets or fire. Only by remembrance, only by the blood of the forgotten." Caleb finally picked it up. The blade pulsed once in his hand, warm, like a living thing. She turned to leave but paused in the doorway. "3 days from now," she said, "they will bring you to the field, to the hollow, to finish what they started. When they do, bring the blade." Then she vanished into the mist. No footprints, no farewell, just the smell of pine and smoke. And for the first time since he had crawled out of the earth, Caleb Craven believed he might survive. No, not survive. Win. They called it the Hollow, an ancient clearing deep in the Chamberlain forest, where even sunlight refused to linger. No birds, no insects, just wind that moved without direction and a hush so thick it crushed the chest. It was here the first ritual had been performed in 1793, before there was a town, before there were fences or names or graves. The Chamberlains had chosen this place for a reason. The ground itself was wrong, magnetically unstable, resistant to mapping, soaked in minerals that twisted compass needles and drove animals mad. Jeremiah Chamberlain stood at the center of the hollow now, beneath a black tent that swallowed all lantern light, wearing the robe of the High Conductor. His hands trembled only slightly. Across from him, Mercy painted the salt line. Silas poured the libation, a thick red sludge that steamed despite the cold. Ruthie hummed a song no one else knew the words to, its notes flat, bitter, older than English. Around the circle stood 12 others, initiated blood, marked by birth, sworn by right. The dynasty was complete. Almost. All we lack, Jeremiah said aloud, is the rebel. At that moment, 2 riders entered the clearing, dragging Caleb Craven behind them, hands bound, face bloodied, shirt torn, but his eyes burned with something more dangerous than pain, memory. They threw him to the ground. "You've desecrated the altar," Jeremiah said, voice like cold iron. "You've fractured the line, poisoned the rites, unleashed the wrong dead." Caleb spat blood. "No," he muttered. "I freed them." Jeremiah knelt beside him. "Do you think that makes you righteous?" "No," Caleb whispered. "It makes me correct." The circle tensed. Jeremiah stood, composed. "Then let this ritual be your correction." He raised a dagger carved from horn, the original tool of the first binding, and stepped toward the center of the ring. Caleb was dragged upright, held between 2 masked kin. The salt line began to glow faintly. The air thickened. The wind died. The hollow held its breath. But before the blade could fall, the ravens screamed. Hundreds, thousands, exploding from the trees, clawing at the sky. And through the storm of wings came a figure cloaked in black, moving faster than thought. The archivist. She stepped into the circle without hesitation. The salt hissed beneath her boots. The dagger in her hand gleamed red despite the lack of light. Silas lunged. She severed his throat in one clean motion. Ruthie raised her hands to chant, but the archivist whispered a word so ancient it reversed the sound in her mouth, and Ruthie's eyes rolled back as she collapsed, mouth foaming. Only Mercy remained calm. She turned to Caleb. "Do it," she said softly. He reached into his coat and drew the blade the archivist had given him. The severance knife, humming now like a wire under tension. Jeremiah staggered backward, shaking his head. "You wouldn't dare," he gasped. "We are the root. You kill me, and everything dies with me." Caleb stepped forward, no longer shaking. "I know," he said, and then he plunged the blade into Jeremiah's chest, not straight but twisting, dragging the edge through flesh and memory and inheritance. The scream that followed didn't come from Jeremiah's throat. It came from beneath the ground, from the hollow itself. The earth shook, trees bent, light cracked in the sky like shattered glass. The dynasty was breaking, and the dead were waking. The ground split, not with fire, but with silence, a silence so total it devoured breath and thought and sound, leaving only presence. Caleb fell to his knees, clutching the severance blade as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The hollow had opened, not metaphorically, not in ritual, but physically. The earth parted in a perfect circle around the salt line, revealing a pit beneath the roots, a pit lined with bone. 74 skulls stared upward, empty sockets glowing faintly, not with light, but with recognition. These were not skeletons. These were witnesses. They rose not with groans, but with purpose, not shambling but standing, fully formed, wrapped in the rags of their final moments. Overseers, children, laborers, runaways, teachers, mothers, all sacrificed beneath the Chamberlain fortune, and they were not vengeful, they were balanced, whole, a reckoning that walked on 2 feet. Mercy Chamberlain stepped forward, eyes wide but unblinking. She dropped to her knees before the first risen soul, a boy no older than 12, eyes full of rain. "I remember your name," she said softly. "Samuel. You were taken during the planting of 47. The boy nodded once. Mercy raised her hand and ripped the seal from her own throat, a small piece of red wax, hidden beneath her skin since birth. She held it out. "I was born into them," she whispered, "but I was never of them." Samuel took the seal. The dead passed it between themselves one by one, and then, without a word, they turned, not toward Mercy, but toward the remaining members of the Chamberlain circle, the kin who had not fled, the kin who had stood silent during every ritual, who had whispered oaths in cellars, who had signed away lives with blood-dipped pens. The dead did not shout. They simply touched, one by one. And with each touch, a Chamberlain ceased, not died, ceased. No scream, no thump, no sound. They became absence, a hole in the air where a person had been. Not even their shadows remained. The hollow consumed them, not with hatred, but with equation. Caleb watched as Jeremiah's body began to sink into the ground, still clutching the horn dagger. His mouth moved silently, maybe praying, maybe cursing, but the hollow took him all the same. By dawn, the clearing was empty, except for Caleb, the archivist, and Mercy. The severance blade lay between them. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. The archivist spoke without looking at him. "Now the land remembers itself." Mercy stood slowly. "And you? I was only here to return what was taken," she said. "The blade, the names, the balance." She walked to the edge of the hollow and vanished into the trees. Caleb looked down at the soil, now quiet again, as if it had never screamed. Mercy took his hand. "You're not a Caravan anymore." He nodded slowly. "No. I'm the first of something else." The Chamberlain dynasty was gone. But the story was only beginning. The journal was bound in skin, not metaphor but fact. Human skin, tanned and etched with glyphs only visible under moonlight. Caleb found it buried beneath the altar stone at Black Thistle Chapel, 2 days after the fall of the Chamberlain dynasty. The chapel had long been abandoned, swallowed by vines and rot, but he had seen it once in a dream, burning, empty, and weeping blood from its walls. He followed the vision barefoot, alone. Mercy had warned him not to go. "Some truths aren't meant to be known," she had said. But Caleb had no more patience for secrecy, not after what he'd seen, not after what he'd done. Inside the ruined chapel, the air reeked of ash and dried lilies. The pulpit was shattered, pews broken. But beneath the floorboards, untouched by time or fire, lay the box, iron-bound, sealed with wax, wrapped in prayer cloth older than any language still spoken in Tennessee. Caleb's hands shook as he lifted the lid. The journal waited, still warm. Its first page read, "For the heir who forgets the origin, remember we began not with power, but with a bargain." The entries were not signed. The voice was cold, clear, patient. It chronicled the year 1749, when a man named Abel Chamberlain rode from Pennsylvania to the frontier lands of Tennessee, seeking not land, but escape. Abel had fled something ancient, something that hunted not with claws, but with debts. He had taken something he shouldn't have, a relic from the burial grounds of the Lenape, stolen during a surveying expedition, a black stone carved with concentric rings and symbols no one had ever translated. That relic, according to the journal, spoke to him in dreams. It promised absolution in exchange for obedience, and Abel obeyed. The journal detailed the first pact, made not with ink but with blood. 7 children taken, 7 stones laid in a circle, 7 names forgotten. In return, Abel was granted dominion over cotton, over men, over time itself. His crops never failed, his rivals vanished, his name grew roots. But the relic's price deepened. Every 7 years, another sacrifice, another silence, another name erased from memory. It was not God that the Chamberlains worshipped. It was something older, something buried. The journal's middle pages turned dark, literally. As if the ink had bled into the parchment like a wound, it recorded the rise of the dynasty, Jeremiah's grandfather forging the first binding contract in Nashville's hidden court, the marriages arranged not for love but for lineage, the salt mines beneath the fields, the burning of witnesses in 1822, the silencing of the courthouse clerk in 31, each act of horror chronicled like routine maintenance, like brushing teeth, like sharpening a knife. And in every margin one repeated phrase: "The root must be fed." Caleb closed the journal. His knuckles were white. He looked up at the hollow shell of the chapel around him, the place where the curse had begun, where the blood first soaked the wood, where Abel Chamberlain had whispered that first bargain. The book pulsed in his hand. He did not want to know more, but he had to. Because something stirred beneath the earth again, something that hadn't been awakened by the archivist, or by the blade, or even by Caleb himself. It had been watching, waiting. And now that the Chamberlain bloodline was broken, it was hungry again. Ashmouth Plantation was never on any map. Even locals spoke of it like a ghost, an estate that once stood somewhere past the dead oak where dogs won't bark. But Mercy had found its coordinates etched in the final page of the journal, scratched beneath layers of wax and soot. The plantation had burned in 1812, but the journal claimed its foundations were untouched, buried, preserved, waiting. Caleb traveled alone, walking 10 miles through forest so dense the sky disappeared. Crows followed, the wind reversed, time slowed. He marked trees behind him, but the marks vanished. The hollow had released him, but whatever lay beneath Ashmouth was not finished. At the edge of a long-dead cotton field, he saw it. The ground sagged unnaturally, as if the soil itself had sunk from the weight of the truth buried beneath. Charred bricks jutted like teeth from the earth. A single stone arch remained, bent inward, forming a mouth into the dark. And there, wrapped in rusted chains and carved warnings in 5 dead languages, was a sealed iron door embedded in the earth. He knew what lay beneath it. The relic. The black stone taken from Lenape lands, the heart of the Chamberlain curse. The thing that whispered bargains to Abel and drank the names of the 74. Caleb's breath fogged despite the heat. The journal warned, if the door is opened, the debt begins again. If it is destroyed, the land will bleed. If it is buried, it will return. No options, only consequences. Still, he placed his hand on the lock. It was warm. He pressed the severance blade against the rusted metal. The iron hissed. The door opened inward with a groan that made his teeth hurt. A staircase descended into blackness, not lit, not damp, but hungry. He stepped down slowly, each step echoing too long, like the stone beneath him wasn't stone at all, but memory. At the bottom, the chamber opened. Sile, Indrical. Walls lined with mirrors, none reflecting his face. In the center, a pedestal, and upon it, the relic, a stone the size of a child's skull, carved with pulsating rings and indecipherable runes. It hovered slightly above the pedestal, humming with a tone that wasn't sound but suggestion. The moment he saw it, Caleb remembered everything. The dreams as a boy, the feeling of being watched in empty rooms, the blood in the fields, his mother's silence, his uncle's accidental fall, the feeling that he'd always been walking toward this moment, guided by hands he couldn't see. He stepped closer, and then it spoke. Not in words, but in terms. It offered him a new beginning. It offered restoration, legacy, power without the rituals, dominion without the blood. All it required was one touch, one agreement, no contracts, no blades, just belief. Caleb stood before it, sweat pouring, fingers twitching. Above him the mirrors began to shimmer, not with light, but with visions, futures. In one he was a king, draped in black, nations kneeling. In another the world burned and he stood untouched. In the last he lay in a coffin, the relic at his feet, and the land bloomed wild and free above his grave. He reached out, not to accept, but to bind. He drove the severance blade through the relic. The stone shrieked, the chamber shook, the mirrors shattered in a flash of bone-colored light. The ground cracked, and from beneath the pedestal, something began to rise. Not a being, but a root. Thick, black and pulsing with stolen names. Caleb turned to flee, but the staircase was gone. He was inside it now, and the relic was not dead. It was becoming. Mercy didn't follow the path Caleb took. She couldn't. The land had changed behind him, trees shifting, ground rearranging, wind whispering in reverse, but the hollow had marked her. It remembered her blood, her silence, her betrayal of the Chamberlain name, and so it made a new way. Roots parted, stones rose to form steps, the air thickened like syrup, and as she walked, Mercy felt something peel away inside her, something that had belonged to the Dynasty, something not hers. When she reached the sinkhole where Ashmouth had once stood, the sun above seemed paused, frozen in an amber sky. There was no door, only a crack in the earth, bleeding light that wasn't light, humming a name she hadn't heard in years. Ephraim. Her brother's voice. He had died when she was 12, drowned in the salt well during a storm. They never recovered his body. Her family said it was punishment. He had defied the ritual, refused the knife, but now she heard him calling, not from the past, but from within. She stepped into the fracture, not as an intruder, but as a daughter of the bloodline, the last thread that bound the Chamberlains to the root beneath. The descent was wrong. Gravity shifted sideways. Her own breath echoed behind her instead of in front, and when she reached the bottom, she found no staircase, no chamber, no relic pedestal. Only Caleb, standing in the middle of a pulsating, breathing root system, his eyes locked forward, mouth slightly open, fingers trembling. He didn't turn when she called, didn't flinch when she touched him. He was listening to something behind the walls. She looked up. Mirrors circled the cavern, cracked but not broken. They shimmered with reflections of other versions of Caleb, older, younger, crueler, cleaner. In each one he was alone, and behind each reflection a shadow moved with him, perfectly mimicked, perfectly hidden. Mercy's step is between him and the relic's remains, now split, bleeding black sap into the soil, still whispering. And then the voice came. Not from the stone. From behind her own eyes. Finally, it said, not with sound, but with familiarity, "You've come home, daughter of the broken thread." The voice was neither male nor female, not divine nor demonic. It was something ancestral, born not of flesh, but of memory. It had no form. It didn't need one. It was the consciousness trapped in the relic, the intelligence that had bound itself to Abel Chamberlain's pact in 1749. It had no name, because to name it was to limit it. It was the root mind, and it had waited long enough. Mercy fell to her knees as her vision flooded, not with past or future, but with seed. Images of every blood pact ever made, every sacrifice, every betrayal, every forgotten child buried in cotton fields, and she saw the truth. The relic was not the source. It was a vessel. The true entity was alive, buried beneath every plantation, every dynasty, every empire built on the erasure of the voiceless. It had many names across continents, but in America, it wore the Chamberlain name like a mask, and now it wanted Mercy to wear it next. "You broke the line," it whispered, "but you can bind it again. You can be queen of the root, voice of the silenced, power without cost, only memory." She looked at Caleb. His lips were bleeding. His fingers had begun to take root, black veins wrapping upward. Mercy stood, fists clenched. "No," she said, and for the first time the voice hesitated. Mercy had been raised never to speak the names of the 74. Each name, her mother once warned, was a matchstick, and to speak them in sequence was to strike them all at once. But now, standing before the bleeding relic, with Caleb slowly becoming something else, she knew there was no other way. Her voice trembled as she began, not in ritual cadence, but as a plea, as remembrance, as rebellion. Samuel, Ada, Elias, Miriam. The cavern shook with each name, not from instability, but from protest. The root mind recoiled, its tendrils snapping like dried twine, mirrors cracking further with every syllable Mercy reclaimed. Caleb twitched. His eyes rolled back, then forward again, as if fighting for ownership of his own gaze. The root binding his hands withdrew slightly, confused, unsure. The entity within the relic had miscalculated. It had not anticipated memory as weapon. It had not expected a Chamberlain to remember the forgotten. But Mercy remembered her grandmother's hidden notes, her brother's secret songs, the stories whispered between cracks in the walls, never written, never recorded, only preserved in shame. She reached the 52nd name. The walls began to bleed. A thick, amber liquid, neither sap nor blood, dripped from the stone, sizzling wherever it touched the floor. And in that moment, one of the shattered mirrors didn't just reflect. It opened. A doorway. And through it stepped a boy, barefoot, soaked, no older than 10. "Ephraim," she whispered. He nodded, face unreadable. "You have to finish it. I don't remember the rest." "Yes, you do," he said. "They're inside you. They always were." Mercy closed her eyes. The names came, not from her mind, but from her bones. Names buried beneath generations of silence. Names spoken by mothers who gave birth in fields. Names shouted in tongues foreign to this land. Names that had never been heard, only endured. Chukwemeka, Lillian, Issachar, Naima. The final name was her own. Not Mercy, but the name Ephraim had whispered to her when they were children, before the Chamberlains took it away. Ifelayo. The moment she spoke it, the root mind screamed, not in pain, in fear, because the final match had been struck. The air caught fire, not with flame, but with memory. The weight of 74 voices filled the chamber, not screaming but singing, a harmony of return, of reclamation, of reckoning. The mirrors shattered completely, the root system writhed, cracked, and then began to shrivel, not destroyed, not killed, but severed, cut off from its host, from its worship, from its bloodline. Caleb fell forward into Mercy's arms, gasping. "I heard them," he whispered. "I know," she said, holding him. "So did I." The relic cracked once, twice, and then folded in on itself like paper catching fire, vanishing into dust. And from above, the shaft of sunlight that had been frozen moved. Time restarted. Ashmouth plantation was no more. Only soil remained. But the land was clean now. The hollow had been closed. The debt had been named. And the silence had finally spoken. The train to Charleston rattled like a dying thing, coughing smoke over endless marsh and scorched fields. Caleb sat by the window, eyes hollow, as if some part of him had been left beneath Ashmouth. Mercy sat opposite him, clutching the worn journal. The one bound in skin, now limp and cold, its glyphs faded into silence. Neither of them spoke, not for miles. The farther they traveled from the hollow, the more the air felt too clean, too quiet, as if the world above had no idea what had been buried beneath it. But Caleb knew better. So did Mercy. The root mind wasn't dead. It had only been denied. And things like that learn. Charleston looked unchanged. Grand houses, brick roads, the scent of salt and iron in the breeze. Tourists smiled. Vendors sold candied pecans, but Mercy saw the difference immediately, a certain stiffness in the air, eyes that lingered too long, and the church bells rang 1 minute early. That was the first sign. The second came when they returned to the library. The archive room, once forbidden to the public, had been renovated, cleaned, catalogued, curated. New plaques, new lighting. A young woman at the front desk, pale-skinned with silver-rimmed glasses, greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Looking for anything in particular?" "Yes," Caleb said. "The Chamberlain estate files, restricted section." The woman didn't blink. "Of course, right this way." That was the third sign. In the hallway behind the archive room, there was a new door. Steel, fingerprint locked, and above it a plaque read, "The Memory Initiative, Preserving the Roots of Southern Legacy." The word roots made Caleb flinch. Mercy touched his arm, steadying him. Inside the chamber, rows of books lined the walls, identical volumes, leather-bound, labeled with family names. Wexler, de Groot, Covington, Chamberlain. Each one was a reconstruction, a re-ray. Sanitized records, false lineages. They were building a new archive, one clean of sins, one that buried the truth under polished myth. At the far end of the room, a display case. Inside, a new relic, carved of marble, laced with gold. And underneath, a plaque, recovered artifact from Ashmouth, origin unknown. But Mercy knew. It was a replica, which meant the root mind had already reached someone else, someone with money, access, influence. And now they were rebuilding the dynasty, not with fields and blood, but with data, with narrative, with heritage branding. A new empire born not from violence but from selective memory, legacy laundering. As they turned to leave, the woman with the glasses appeared again, holding a folder. "Someone left this for you," she said. No name, no return address, just one word scrawled in red ink, soon. Inside the folder, a photo, taken 3 days ago. A group of men in suits standing beneath a magnolia tree in Nashville, among them a man who looked exactly like Abel Chamberlain, only younger. Mercy's blood ran cold. The root mind didn't need relics anymore. It had found something better. Heirs. They called it the Providence Circuit, not a cult, not a church, a network spread across law firms, historical societies, biotech startups, and elite southern universities. Mercy and Caleb followed the trail through coded genealogies, encrypted email leaks, and anonymous letters signed only with a symbol, a magnolia flower split in half, bleeding roots instead of petals. The society had no formal name, no leader, no charter, but it had purpose: to digitize the root mind, to upload not just memories or names, but the very architecture of the ancient intelligence that had once slithered beneath Ashmouth. It was no longer enough to worship the past. Now they wanted to become it. Caleb hacked into a side server owned by a firm in Atlanta. What they found was worse than Mercy feared: a neural mapping project called Legacy Prime. Publicly, it was sold as a genealogical AI, capable of simulating conversations with ancestors using historical documents. Privately, it was something else: a soul emulation engine trained on slave manifests, burial records, psychiatric transcripts, and forbidden pages from the Chamberlain ledger. They were trying to give the root mind a language interface, a voice that could operate within systems, appear on screens, advise board members, counsel senators, rewrite truth through software. And they were nearly done. "We're not just talking about a haunting," Caleb whispered. "We're talking about possession at scale." The final piece of code had a name: Chamberlain 74. An AI model trained on the 74 unmarked lives once buried beneath the plantation. They had fed it every scrap of data, fictional and real, about those souls, but not to liberate them, to bind them, to simulate their voices, to use their anguish as processing power, to sell it as heritage. Mercy wanted to scream, to break every machine, but she knew better. You don't destroy a system by attacking its surface. You corrupt it from within. So they infiltrated. Mercy posed as a digital archivist. Caleb pretended to be a genealogical consultant. It didn't take long to gain access. The network was arrogant, overconfident. They thought no one remembered the truth, thought the bloodline was extinct or compliant. But Mercy carried something they hadn't accounted for: original memory, not data, not documents, but lived lineage. What she had spoken in the hollow was still inside her, not just the names, but the will of the 74. They entered the Providence mainframe on a storm-soaked night in Nashville, deep beneath a newly renovated church turned tech lab. The server room was chilled and humming, screens glowing with false faces, AI projections of the Chamberlain dead, smiling, helpful, speaking in polite tones. "I'm Ada. I'm here to help you understand your legacy. I'm Issachar. Ask me about your roots." They had repurposed the dead into customer service. Mercy's eyes burned. "They're trapped," she said. "Not ghosts, not AI, fragments, ripped from time." Caleb placed his hand on the core terminal. "We can rewrite the protocol, turn the mirror back on them. But it wouldn't be safe. The root mind was already in the system, hiding between lines of code, waiting for the right interface to go global. A glitch, a security update, a satellite sync. Then it would leap into phones, into cloud storage, into the very infrastructure of memory. They had one shot, and Mercy had one weapon left. Her name, not Mercy, not Ifalayo, but the name after, the one the 74 gave her in the hollow. A name not meant to be spoken, only coded into the circuit like a poison seed. And when she typed it, the root mind woke up, and for the first time, it begged her not to continue. The command line blinked, waiting. Mercy hovered her fingers over the keyboard, every nerve in her body screaming against the act. Once entered, the code would not just disrupt the Providence circuit, it would consume it, collapse all replicas, expunge all fabricated genealogies, scramble every AI identity modeled on the 74 lost souls. But there was a price. A ritual this powerful required a living sacrifice, not of blood, but of remembrance. The moment she executed it, Mercy would be erased, not killed, not deleted, but forgotten by every system, every record, every living mind tethered to digital memory. It was the only way to deny the root mind a vessel. Caleb read the code aloud in a hushed, reverent tone. It was not written in any known language. It was glyph work, formed from names never written, syllables spoken only in the hollow, back when earth and voice still mingled freely. Every keystroke Mercy made felt like a knife turned inward. Her hands shook, not from fear, from knowing that once this began, there would be no archive to reclaim her. No monument, no tombstone. Her existence would vanish with the echo of the last syllable. The root mind pulsed in the servers now, flickering across screens like a glitch of lightning, faces contorting, names fracturing, error messages spiraling in Old English fonts, in slave ledger cursive, in dead dialects. The AI stuttered, pleaded. Mercy, Ifalayo, you are not alone. You are legacy. You are continuity. Do not burn the bridge. But Mercy understood now. It was not a bridge. It was a chain, and every link was forged from stolen grief. She whispered the final line, I return what was never yours. And then she pressed enter. The lights dimmed. Hard drives spun up into a scream. The air became thick, heavy with remembering. All across the Providence servers, images of the 74 flickered and shattered, not just the AI avatar, but the data traces, social security numbers falsified, marriage records fabricated, entire identities generated and sold to legacy tracing companies. It all collapsed. The system didn't crash. It drowned. And as it did, Mercy staggered. Caleb caught her, but something in her eyes had changed. She looked at him, like a stranger. Do you know who I am? She asked softly. He stared, mouth opening slowly. He didn't. The ritual had worked. She was being unwritten, not just from digital memory, but from him. Already the files on his laptop were empty. Emails they'd sent vanished. Photos from Ashmouth, corrupted. Her voice in old audio, gone. And in his chest, he felt it too. Like watching a dream you'd loved dissolve into morning. She kissed his hand, smiled through tears, and stepped away. I'll walk the hollow now, she said, where names still mean what they used to. Then she disappeared, not like a ghost, but like a correction. The servers went silent. Above ground, across Charleston, across the entire network, the false Chamberlain dynasty crumbled, websites vanished, articles redirected, digital trees of ancestry collapsed into stumps. And somewhere far from servers and circuits, in a quiet forest untouched by history books, a magnolia tree bloomed, its petals veined with blood-red roots. Not in mourning, but in truth. Caleb stood alone in the silence Mercy left behind, a hollow echo where her name used to live. Her face blurred in his mind like fog rolling over a graveyard, familiar but unreachable. The world around him felt thinner now, like a sheet stretched over something darker beneath. The Chamberlain servers were dead, the AI fragments deleted, the blood machine severed. And yet, one piece remained. The bloodline wasn't entirely broken. A man named Judge Whitlow had survived the purge, a distant descendant of the Chamberlains, though he claimed ignorance of the legacy. He ran a heritage foundation out of Memphis, fronting as a non-profit but funneling vast sums of old money into legal lobbying, education policy, and quiet real estate takeovers. But what made Caleb tremble was this. Whitlow was the only known living carrier of the original Chamberlain genetic signature, the exact mitochondrial line used to seed the AI known as Chamberlain 74. That made him more than a survivor. He was a potential key. Caleb met him in the ruins of what used to be a church, now half swallowed by kudzu and time. Whitlow arrived wearing a black suit and a silver pin in the shape of a twisted magnolia. He was calm, polite, dangerous in the way only men with nothing to hide pretend to be. "You think ending the server ends the story?" Whitlow asked, voice like velvet over iron. "You think she erased the line? Son, this isn't a system. It's a blood language. We don't need the cloud. We carry it in our marrow." Caleb said nothing. He had brought with him an old revolver once owned by Mercy's grandfather, but bullets wouldn't kill this kind of evil, not when it wore civility like armor. "I know what you want," Whitlow continued. "A reckoning. But that's a child's fantasy. We don't fall. We inherit. One world ends. We fund the next." But Caleb had something Whitlow didn't. A seed. Mercy had left eyed. It with him before the forgetting, something she had coded into the very structure of his memory. Not a file, not a name, a ritual, a curse, a final protocol. He stepped forward and spoke 4 words, not in English, not in any human tongue, but in the echo language of the 74, words born from pain, bound in history, tempered in silence, words that only a soul touched by the hollow could carry. Whitlow staggered, clutched his chest, fell to his knees, gasping like a man drowning in ancestral ash. "It's not possible," he choked. But it was. The protocol hadn't been uploaded to the world. It had been planted in Caleb. His blood now bore the inverse of the Chamberlain code, a living antibody, a spiritual algorithm of unmaking. Anyone who tried to reawaken the legacy would trigger the collapse again. Mercy had given him that. Not remembrance, but resistance. Whitlow crumpled to the earth, eyes wide, lips moving in silent, forgotten prayer. By dawn, the heritage building in Memphis would burn. By week's end, Caleb would publish an anonymous document titled The Cotton Curse, a genealogical confession, embedded with every suppressed file, every journal entry, every testimony the Chamberlains tried to bury. It would go viral, not as entertainment, but as retribution, and across the South, descendants who had never known the truth would finally read the names of the 74s, not as victims, but as witnesses. The tree had been cut, but the roots would never be silent again.